As Russia ramps up nuclear threats amid the war in Ukraine, there's been a surge in spending among nuclear-armed states on weapons of mass destruction. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute has released a report warning nuclear weapons haven't played such a prominent role in global relations since the Cold War. Russia and its ally Belarus carried out more nuclear drills this month. The exercises were designed to discourage Western support for Ukraine. In a separate report, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, says there was a $10 billion increase in global spending on nuclear weapons last year. And we can now bring in Dan Smith. He's the director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Dan, welcome to DW. Tell me, how could all that money spent on nuclear weapons be put to better use?
I think the difficulty is deciding amongst so many important priorities. We have an ecological crisis, which badly needs money. We have a green transition that we need to invest in. Development spending is under pressure and going down. There are increasing calls for humanitarian funds to be available. Numerous countries in Western Europe, as well as in the developing world, need more infrastructure spending. There are crises in health provision and in education. There are so many calls upon the available resources that we have that it really is striking that so much money seems to be so easily available for weapons of mass destruction compared to how much is available for ordinary citizens' welfare.
Yeah. That said, do you think Ukraine, we just talked about the peace summit, would find itself in the situation it is in right now if it had not given up its nuclear weapons to Russia?
It's a hypothetical question, obviously, and therefore difficult to answer. One can easily say that a nuclear-armed Ukraine might not have come under attack, but remember that territory was attempted to be seized from the UK, which is a nuclear-armed power, by Argentina, which was not 40 years ago. India and Pakistan, both nuclear-armed, have had face-offs and military clashes at their borders over decades, including the last 20 years when they've both had nuclear weapons. And in addition, I think the important thing is to say that in the early 1990s, when Ukraine has emerged as an independent state out of the Soviet Union and had nuclear weapons on its territory, technically one could say, or legally one could say, they could have taken over those weapons, but they did not have the capacity as a state at that time, as a government, to be able to control those nuclear weapons. So the correct thing to do was indeed to make sure that they went to a country that was able to control and look after them, which in that case was Russia. And then, of course, there was the Budapest Memorandum, which gave undertakings to Ukraine, and that has not been respected neither by Russia nor by the Western powers who agreed to support Ukraine were its sovereignty ever to be challenged. Yeah. So it's an interesting hypothetical question, but in my mind, there is no doubt that for the safety of all of us, the right thing to do in the early 90s was to hand back the nuclear weapons.
Let's look at the situation at hand right now. Then, since Russia's war in Ukraine, there's been less transparency over nuclear development. That's another finding of your report. Where does that put us in terms of monitoring and control of weapons of mass destruction?
Well, it puts us in a very difficult place. And it also puts us in a difficult place because arms control between the USA and Russia on nuclear weapons has more or less collapsed. Russia has suspended its participation in the Strategic Arms Control Agreement, the New START Treaty, which came into force originally in 2011. So we have much less transparency. We're very clear in the report that we present that these figures are estimates. We believe in them quite strongly. We are confident about them, but we have not been able to, no one has been able to count the weapons one by one. There's a large factor of estimation in there. And that, of course, is worrying. Things could be going on that we do not know about.
That was Dan Smith, the director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Now let's bring in Jim Walsh. He's a senior research associate at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Security Studies program. Welcome to The Day. Now, with these numbers out today, do you think the world has become a more dangerous place?
Oh, without doubt. It's the combination of two things. One is all the nuclear weapon states are expanding either their arsenals or their arsenals' capabilities. And at the same time this is happening, we see a decline in U.S.-Russian arms control. Since 1986, and it was referenced in your report, since 1986, the number of nuclear weapons has gone down each year, driven largely by Russian and American arms control. They, after all, have 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. And so when they cut, those numbers went down. But they've stopped cutting, and the other countries are building their stockpile or building its sophistication. Britain has now expanded its cap for potential nuclear arsenal by 200 weapons. China's building missile silos. And with each development, then the other countries respond in kind. So now the United States, which has far more nuclear weapons than China and a far bigger military than China, made hints last week that, well, it may need to build more nuclear weapons to respond to China, which of course is responding to the U.S. So this competition, the potential for an arms race is growing at the very moment when international institutions and agreements are falling apart. And that is not a good combination.
With the U.S. being responsible for 80% of that increase in spending on nuclear weapons, is the U.S. driving this?
I don't think that spending is driving it. And here it's worth, again, reminding ourselves that the U.S. and Russia have kept caps on their nuclear weapons. So they have not been building additional nuclear weapons. What they've done is improve their capabilities and the things that they can do. But they've kept the numbers the same and flat. But that treaty is set to expire. And soon we will be on the precipice of everyone building more weapons and having no limitations. Now, to your question, the U.S. has contributed to the situation in general. This just didn't spring up today, right? Basically, since the end of the Cold War, people stopped paying attention to nuclear weapons. We had had such great success. All sorts of treaties reduced the stockpiles by nearly 60,000 nuclear weapons. And then when the Cold War ended, we said, well, you know, the threat's over. We're done with that. We're going to move on to other things. And now, having ignored it for all these years, it has come back with a vengeance. The Chinese will say, well, we have to build more because the U.S. is building missile defenses and it has a larger arsenal. And then the U.S. is going to say, well, if China's building, we have to build more. So we have fundamentally lost track of the overall directive to reduce nuclear weapons because they represent a potential extinction event. Instead, we're back to the old ways. Well, if you have some, I want one more than you do.
Jim, let's look at China. China is rapidly expanding its nuclear arsenal. Why and why now?
Well, I think it is, and still, it's starting at a lower number, right? The U.S. and Russia have 90%. They have, we'll call it 10,000 nuclear weapons to make it easy. China has about 600, right? So, and it's not one for one, but still, China has always traditionally had a lower arsenal. What has changed? Two things. One, China is a growing power. It has more resources. It feels like it has to have a bigger place on the stage. But more importantly, what they perceive as a security threat. The U.S. Officials have said that they want to ring China with missile defenses. China, see those missile defenses as a threat to their strategic deterrence. If our missile defenses can shoot down all their nuclear weapons and they only have 600, then they are vulnerable to all attack by the U.S. So what is the natural, unfortunately, rational response to that? To build more missiles. And that's why we used to have treaties that prevented missile defense so countries would not get involved in arms racing. We abandoned those treaties, and now what do we have? Arms racing. It shouldn't be a surprise, but it is a danger nonetheless.
Sounds very much like back in the Cold War. Do you think that the US and China, for example, should engage in talks to limit this arms race?
Of course they should. They should have been doing it for decades. China has had nuclear weapons since 1964. There's never been a U.S.-Chinese arms control negotiation. Never. Not in 75 years. In fact, all the countries that own nuclear weapons have never, ever sat down together to negotiate on that topic, ever. As I say, we had success, but a lot of missed opportunities. You know, with the end of the Cold War, we had a chance to really shut this down in a more fundamental way. But the U.S. said, you know, well, we've won, and they didn't want to really talk to the Chinese, and the Chinese were a tiny player anyway. Well, you know, fast forward 40 years or whatever, and it's not that situation anymore. And you haven't talked to China, and you haven't talked to China, and now suddenly they don't want to talk. And that's what you reap when you plant those seeds. So I think immediately the thing to do is to start talking, right? The NPT, the most important nuclear treaty in the world, obliges the nuclear weapon states to bargain in good faith. Article 6, bargain in good faith to eliminate their nuclear weapons. You'd think the first thing they could do is sit down and talk to each other about it.
Start talking, always good advice. There from Jim Walsh from the Security Studies Program at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us, Jim.